More divisive wars we've ever had in the United States, and that would be Vietnam. I'm going to break this up into two videos, and so the first one I'm going to go here right about when Vietnam's getting interesting with the French and everything, up until about the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and then 1968 we'll really move into the other things, okay? Now, first thing we have to know is the name. During colonization, or imperialism as we called it here in America, France and England basically carved up what is called Southeast Asia. France belonged to a part of thing here, and they called it French Indochina. And it consisted of Anan, which is now Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, everything like that. But they called it French Indochina. Indochina meaning inner. As you can see, China is right here, and this is a little bit further down. Okay? So French Indochina is another name for Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Now, during World War II, the Japanese controlled all this, and they basically overran it. When the war is over, the French go back to controlling this, and that is where we meet the first problem. The Vietnamese were very adamant of kicking out the Japanese, and in fact they had formed their own army called Viet Minh. Viet Minh was a communist state. As you can tell here, there's a flag, I imagine it's red, associating that with communism. And so the Viet Minh, it actually means Army of Light, and they kicked out the Japanese, and so much like Korea, they decide they're going to spread communism. Now, if you know anything about the United States, we don't want the spread of communism at all. Now, the leader of the Viet Minh was given the name Ho Chi Minh, which means bringer of light. And so Ho Chi Minh was essentially a communist. He was Vietnam's Mao. He was Vietnam's Lenin. He wasn't very as oppressive as I'd say maybe Stalin or Mao, a little bit more moderate in that sense. But he did want to spread communism, and so that put him on our enemy list, okay? Now, in 1954, immediately after Korea has ended in 53 in an armistice, which Korea was a win for containment. We kept communism from spreading. They went back across the 38th parallel, and in fact, it's still kind of a war today. It's never ended. So, yay for containment. So we decided to do it again in Southeast Asia. Now, the reason here, and I'll get into it in a second, is Eisenhower had a plan, and he said that if Vietnam fell to communism, everybody else would. And I'll get that here in a second with you. So what do we need out of the 54 Geneva Convention? They decide to split Vietnam in half. And so this was their solution, because it worked great with Korea, right? The Democrats, being a democratic country, mainly being France, would have the South, and the North would become communist. They were to have free elections, and out of these free elections, they would decide whether the whole country would be communist or not. Now, there was a problem, however, and we'll kind of move it down in a second. And so here is the zone here. This is the 17th parallel, not to be confused with the 38th parallel. And so the green would be South Vietnam, and that was, again, ruled by the French. And then North Vietnam, as you can tell, is right by China, who we know in 49 became communist as well from the Soviet Union. So you can see how that's working down. Spread of communism is a fear. Now, Eisenhower's idea is called the domino theory or domino effect. And that is that if Vietnam, being the first domino, falls to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia will, and that includes Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, and Bangladesh, which, I mean, that's a lot of people to fall to communism. So our idea is we're going to beef up Vietnam, prevent it from falling to communism, and then we'll see how that works. Now, the problem with Vietnam is it becomes a quagmire. Giggity. Not this quagmire. Quagmire in the sense of a quagmire is a bog. It's something that you get into, and it's very difficult to get out of. Now, why does this pertain to the United States? Remember I said France was there. Well, in 54, Eisenhower kind of did a kind of behind door deal with France and said, hey, we've got to keep Vietnam democratic. We've got to keep communism out, and we're actually paying a large portion of France's debt to fight this war against the Viet. They're now called the Viet Cong, and I'll get to that in a second. So when they decide they can't leave, well, we've got a problem. Now, what happened in the long and the short of the elections? Well, the elections were not held. There was a military coup in the South, and a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem was put into power. Now, Ngo Dinh Diem had pretty strict ties to the United States, and France will leave shortly after Kennedy is elected, and Kennedy begins sending a little bit more muscle over there. Now, we know 63 is a bad year, because not only does Kennedy die, but also Ngo Dinh Diem, and there's a conspiracy theory behind that Ngo Dinh Diem's wife killed Kennedy and had the power, which, if you're into conspiracy theories, that information is out there for you. Now what happens is, the next year in 64, and so there's Ngo Dinh Diem, he is assassinated. There's Kennedy in his infamous car in Dallas, in which he will be assassinated as well. And that happened in 63. Now in 64, we get Lyndon B. Johnson as our president. He was vice president under Kennedy, and he is actually elected in 64. So Lyndon Johnson takes president in 64, and he kind of inherits this Vietnam problem, I guess you could call it. Now, one of the big things he said as he was running for president in 64 is, we Americans know, although others seem to forget, the risk of splitting conflict. We seek no wider war. And so everybody kind of bought into this and said, yes, we want Johnson. He seems like he's level-headed. Everything going fine. Now that contrasts with what happens in 64 at a place called the Gulf of Tonkin. As you can see, this is the Gulf of Tonkin here. Now what happened at the Gulf of Tonkin is still kind of up in the air, and I'll show you in the, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get here. Yeah, I don't have it. I'll show you what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin according to McNamara, who was there. But basically, we had two boats. One was the USS Maddox, and that was the one I want to focus on here. And they're patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin, and they are fired upon. Now, the first time they said they're fired upon, and they went through and they said do nothing. The second time they're fired upon, Johnson does something that no president should be able to do, and no president can do afterwards. And that is, he wants a resolution to what he calls the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And what happens here is, it's basically the Gulf of Tonkin gives President Johnson limited war powers. But in essence, he's allowed to declare war on North Vietnam, the communist, because of this. And because of this, we start sending large number of troops. So 64 is really the big thing, and the Gulf of Tonkin is there. And one thing you have to understand about Gulf of Tonkin, it's an expansion of executive powers, kind of going beyond the realm of what we thought they should do. And so, naturally, with that in mind, Operation, what was the name of that operation? I can't remember. Anywho, we began to, Rolling Thunder, that was it. Operation Rolling Thunder goes through, and we begin to start bombing these different things, and there's a resolution, and as it was said, fight as we must. All right. And so again, this is just like Korea. We don't consult Congress before we go to war. And however, after this one in 74, the War Powers Act makes sure of that. Now, in the next video, I'll go from 68 all the way through the fall of Saigon in 75.